This podcast is sponsored by Milliman. As one of the world's largest actuarial and consulting firms, Milliman's work is vital to solving the challenges faced by our clients, society, and the world. Through actuarial, risk management, and related technology and data solutions, we help companies navigate the complex health, finance, and insurance landscape. Because the future demands a different kind of thinking from a different kind of company. To learn more, visit milliman.com.
Hello and welcome to the third podcast from the Actuary, produced on behalf of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, the IFOA. I'm Jon Watkins, a financial journalist, and as always, I will be your host for this podcast episode. For the next half hour or so, I'll be talking to three fantastic guests. We've got Honorary Fellow and Star Statistician David Spiegelhalter, a member of the IFOA Sustainability Board, and an actuary behind an art startup in South Africa. First, joining us in the studio is David Spiegelhalter, a household name when it comes to popularising statistics in the UK. He was recently interviewed in the Actuary's January-February edition and joins us now for a deeper dive chat. David, thanks for joining us. So David, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So we've seen you on TV, we've heard you on the radio, we've read your books, but outside of the spotlight, you're Statistics Emeritus Professor at Cambridge University. Tell us a bit about what you're working on at the moment.
Well, emeritus means I'm retired. I've been retired for 5 years, so I'm trying not to work on anything at all. I want to be on holiday, really. But I still am a bit busy, and on a lot of it is on communication. Got this book out, which I am relentlessly plugging, so I'm not going to apologise for that. The Art of Uncertainty, available from all good bookshops. And so that's quite enjoyable. And I also, doing odd bits of media work, which I enjoy doing, commenting on news stories. I've got a sort of official job, part-time. I'm a non-executive director of the UK Statistics Authority, which is the body that oversees both the Office for National Statistics, producing the census and all the GDP figures, etc., but also the Office for Stats Regulation, which I'm particularly interested in, the stats regulator, the sort of the sort of watchdog for official statistics and how they're used, which can put ministers on the naughty step publicly. So I quite enjoy being involved with that. So I'm not doing research anymore, which is a great relief not having to bother with that. But I do kind of still write stuff, opinion pieces and so on.
And you plugged your book, so I'll plug our January-February edition of the Actuary, in which you are featured and you're interviewed.
Great.
In that, you describe yourself as both an introvert and a show-off. So tell us a bit about that and how you juggle that.
I was curious that I said that, but it's actually true. I mean, I'm in my dotage, I sort of reflecting on my life, and I realised, my goodness, I am an introvert. I'm someone who gets energy really from being on my own, rather than other people. Mm-hmm. I find many social occasions deeply stressful, especially standing around in a reception or sitting next to someone I don't particularly want to talk to. I only really want to talk, mainly enjoy talking to intimate friends and so on. I'm quite good at that. And I love spending large amounts of time on my own, walking or just sitting on my own. I can go days without speaking to anyone, and I'm utter joy. However, on the other hand, I'm a performer. I love getting up on stage to something, as long as I know what I'm doing. I mean, there's lots of performances I wouldn't want to do. But in terms of getting up and giving talks in front of large audiences, speaking in front of crowds, literary festivals and stuff like that, I've done that all my career of getting up and giving talks, and I enjoy it. And I think I'm quite good at it as well. I do feel quite relaxed. I go into performance mode. I get nervous beforehand, but I can do it. So that's right. And I don't think there's a contradiction between those two. I have been called a high-functioning introvert, which is I thought quite generous. But that's definitely, it's quite nice to actually realise that's actually how I operate.
On a slightly more serious note, from your interview with us in the magazine profile, you talked about your dislike for misinformation, and obviously we live in this internet age, but we're also seeing the rise of social media channels and a lot of discussion around misinformation there. Is it something we just have to accept now?
Oh, well, it's difficult to deal with. And I'm always interested in misinformation about numbers. But, of course, it's hugely more than that and will become even more important with the ability to manipulate images and videos and so on. That there'll be and the increasing, in a way, sort of non-text communications going on through videos and images. That's with the rise of Instagram and TikTok. And so it's a very different sort of misinformation than what I'm perhaps used to dealing with. I'm used to critiquing numerical claims in the news. And I've done that for years and years. But actually things are moving. And I don't know how one is going to deal with it. The first thing is you cannot get rid of it. Mm-hmm. And so I increasingly feel the need is, and it's easy to say it's to do with education. I think it is to do with education. I think it's an integral part, it should be in schools education, is to be able to critique all the stuff that flows in through your, into your feed in social media, and to be skeptical about it. Do I really believe this? Do I like it? Do I believe it? What could be wrong with this? And so on. I just think this is just an essential skill for everyone now.
There's been some big recent events and some ongoing areas that are particularly reliant or I guess really enhance the need for and the value of data. If you think about the pandemic period, social channels and the fact that we have so much more insight into everything now, climate change and things like that, they're all very data-heavy subjects, aren't they? Is there a greater need for all of us to have access to more data? Is that a thing?
Well, I think there's a need for greater data literacy, which is not necessarily to do with actually doing any analysis, but being able to critique the claims that are made and to have what I would regard as a slightly skeptical but not cynical view about all the numbers that get thrown at us. I thought on the whole, COVID was a positive experience when it came to data and the realization that the public actually wanted it and could deal with considerable complexity of argument and graphics and so on. As I say in my article, the actuaries did a fantastic job during COVID. They really did. Very balanced, good analysis, regular, active on social media. I just felt pleased to be kind of part of that gang, which I was trying to be part of as well, of being someone in the middle, being attacked by both sides. Because you're being attacked by the extreme, we've got to close everything down, we mustn't have any, essentially zero COVID approaches. And the other approach says, well, this is all a complete scam. And so at those two ends, the actuaries and myself and a whole gang of others, we're sort of in the middle, getting fired at from all sides. So it must have been the right place to be.
In your interview with us, you talked about one of the toughest parts of your career has been your contributions to public inquiries. You're involved in you contributed to the public inquiry around Harold Shipman, also the Bristol Royal Infirmary, and I think the infected blood scandal. You talked about it being a tough thing to do in your career, but you also talked about it being rewarding. Why is it rewarding, and why is that? Why do your contributions to those inquiries have such an impact on you?
Yeah, because it's important. And I think I used this term in the interview. It's mandated science. You've got to try to answer the questions whether you want to or not. So it's different from sort of voluntary research. You really are trying to answer those questions. And it's rewarding because you feel you are doing something important. People listen. Our analysis for the infected blood inquiry in terms of the number of people who got infected, the numbers of subsequent deaths, that's accepted. That is now accepted. Our analysis, what happened at Bristol, what happened to Shipman, when he could have been caught, and so on, I think it has had an impact in terms of monitoring systems that have been developed since then. And so I think it is important. And these are real problems involving real people. And one of the things that happens at these inquiries is that at the end you have to stand up and be being questioned by a senior lawyer. And in each of those three cases, the families of the victims were sitting in the front row. Wow. They're there, and you're looking at them. And so it's very humbling indeed. And you have to say, and I have to kind of got a bit practiced at this, at saying that we apologise because it can sound quite harsh. Mortality rates, counting the number of deaths and so on, can sound really impersonal. But I have to say, statisticians are completely aware that every single number in that is an individual case, and the tragic influence upon their family and so on. However, it's only by putting all these individual experiences together that we can get an impression of the magnitude of what's gone on and how possibly it might be prevented in the future. So, and tomorrow I'm appearing at the Thirlwall inquiry into Lucy Letby, and I'm going to have to say something very similar.
Yeah, as you say, rewarding in the sense that it's important work, right? And I guess it's helping the victims and the families of those victims to achieve, an understanding of what went wrong. And
exactly,
so on.
We've received great messages of gratitude from families. Also, professionally, it's just fascinating and has given rise to new methodology. In Shipman's case, and also it's for the Thirlwall inquiry. What it's really gave me an insight into is how important it is to be able to express some, not doubts, but some caution about one's entire modelling that's being done. Because, and I got quite a whole chapter in my book about expressing confidence in your analysis. And in area after area, in climate change and in intelligence and things like that, people have gone beyond just trying to put probabilities on stuff or doing estimates, putting intervals and so on, to be able to say, well, actually, I have some doubts about my whole understanding of the problem. My whole technical analysis is, maybe not great. And so this has become very common. It became common in COVID that, people could make a sort of scientific claim and they say, well, I've only got moderate confidence in my analysis of what I've done, or low confidence or high confidence sometimes. In the in the infected blood inquiry, we had high confidence in the HIV results, but in hepatitis B, we were asked how many cases there had been, and we said we're not going to try to answer that question.
Right.
We have such low confidence in the data and any analysis we can do. We refuse to answer the question, which we had to be quite bold to do that because we had been asked to ask that question.
Yeah. It's quite a good segue into my next question. I think you mentioned your latest book, The Art of Uncertainty, available in all good bookshops. But you mentioned in the book there, I think in your own words, probability rarely exists at all. That's a great line. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah. That's my little sort of bugbear that I've had for 50 years, that about kind of what is probability? We talk about the probability of this, probability of that. Well, what is it? What are we talking about? We put numbers on these, numbers on risks. Well, actually, what are those numbers? What do they actually mean? And people tend not to think about this. They just do the stuff and do statistical analysis and calculate confidence intervals and all this sort of stuff. But I was brought up, right from as a late teenager into, in a way, the philosophy of probability. And I was indoctrinated at a very early age by my mentor in Oxford at the time, Adrian Smith, now president of the Royal Society, Sir Adrian Smith, who was translating a book by an Italian actuary, De Finetti, which starts with the statement, probability does not exist. Deliberately provocative. And I've followed that the whole time. I just don't believe it's there. I think we just made it up. That's why I think it was only developed in the 1650s, really. It was very late in coming because we had to make up the idea. Because you can't measure probabilities. No. It's not there. You can measure length and weight and height and temperature and all this stuff. You can't measure probabilities. You can assess them based on assumptions. You can look at a coin or something. You can analyze lots of data. But you can produce these probabilities. They're not there. They're not. I don't believe they're objective properties of the outside world. This is ignoring the quantum world. I'm not an expert on that, but even that is disputed about whether those probabilities are really objective properties or whether they're also just our subjective judgments. So this is officially known as the subjectivist Bayesian approach to probability, and that's what I I believe. I've never had any reason to shift from that.
One of the things you have in common with actuaries is communicating difficult concepts and facts in a way that others can understand them. And do you have a tip for how to do that?
Oh, it's the usual stuff, I suppose. Imagine you're talking to not your mother or your parents because they love you too much, but there's some old uncle or something like that who's a bit of a miserable sod and a bit sceptical, and so needs to be spoken to. You've got to assume people are intelligent, but assume they don't know anything. So that means getting rid of all jargon. You have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of someone who knows very little. And I think I've got reasonably good at this. I must say, actuaries, if I judge by the material I used to get with my pension, are not great at it.
Yeah.
An incredible assumption about other people's knowledge. Even when they try to write in a simple way. So, and this is all testable. I mean, the crucial thing is there's no correct way to communicate any of this stuff. You just got to decide who is the audience, what are you trying to do, and then test it.
Yeah.
So there's no right or wrong in any of this stuff.
No, that's fair. You're a Sir, an OBE, Fellow of the Royal Society, past President of the Royal Statistical Society, Honorary Fellow of the IFOA. What's missing? What would you like to add?
Oh, no, I don't want any more letters. I can't, I got a stupid long surname anyway, so I got enough of these. No, I quite enough letters, I definitely. Okay. I still have ambitions. My biggest ambition was to get on Desert Island Discs, which I've done. And I have to admit, my other ambition is to appear at Glastonbury. And
for those that haven't heard it, what was the item that you took with you to your desert island?
Oh, it was very bright. It was a book of killer Sudokus.
Okay, I would expect that.
Which I am addicted to. So I thought I can take my addiction with me.
Keep you occupied for a good while. Yeah. Oh, that's a brilliant note to end on, and thank you for sharing your story with us.
No, it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for your time. That's great. Thanks, David, so much. And do please read the interview with David in the January-February edition or online at theactuary.com.
Join the IFOA President, Kartina Tahir-Thompson, for a celebratory and charity dinner at the prestigious Banking Hall, London, on the evening of the 24th of April 2025. An evening of superb food and company will provide the backdrop to an exciting live auction that could change lives. All proceeds from the event will go to the IFOA Foundation. Your support will make a lasting impact on the future of our profession. Find out more on the Actuary website, theactuary.com.
Now we're talking to Lucy Saye, a sustainability actuary and former chair of the IFOA Sustainability Board. Lucy's co-authored the IFOA's latest climate change report, Planetary Solvency, which came out in January, and is here to talk a bit more about that. Lucy, thanks so much for joining us to talk about this really pressing global issue. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, John. It's really good to be able to talk about a report, and so much effort has gone into it. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get into that a little bit now. So the new Planetary Solvency report is what you're referring to. Can you explain the concept behind that and what's the main message from it?
Yeah, sure. So we sort of define planetary solvency as managing human activity to minimise the loss of societal disruption from the loss of critical support services from nature. So in sort of plain English, it's framing the concept of solvency, so that ability to meet one's liabilities from their assets, and we frame that in the sort of sense of our planet. So nature is our asset, and the benefits we get from nature, so those ecosystem services, are the liabilities that we benefit from. And as we erode nature through things like climate change and biodiversity loss, but also the breakdown of the social relationships, we undermine the solvency of our planet. So it's really about reframing humans and our economy as being firmly embedded within nature. And that's very much the sort of view of the Dasgupta report that was before this one. And then it's about taking this one step further. So saying, well, within that, how do we apply some risk concepts? So things like risk appetite, tolerances, limits into that context, and looking at where our sort of current risk position is and where we might be heading. Because as we know, we're sort of undermining some of these critical support infrastructures. We're undermining those assets, and what risks does that pose to society? So we come up with a number of principles, but largely it's around us doing a realistic risk assessment. And I think the most important thing here is to note that there is no new science in this report. This is where we're just saying things are really different from a risk perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And like those previous IFOA climate change reports to which you also contributed, it's a clarion call to actuaries across all sectors, isn't it? What practical things can they do to respond?
Yeah, so I think this report is probably a bit more targeted towards policymakers than the previous reports have been. Um, because overall, all of the reports have been saying, well, actually, there's a huge understatement of these risks. And so the first thing is it's important for actuaries, wherever they're working, to say, understand why these risks have been understated for so long and the consequences that that may have for the companies in which they work. But this report sort of goes one step further, and it's about saying to policymakers, on a risk basis, you are taking inadequate action. Yes, there's loads of uncertainty, but when we have high uncertainty, we apply the principle of prudence, and that is early action. If we think there could be a big risk that has a really negative impact to society, we should be taking the cautious approach, and that's earlier action, more quickly. And of course, the message really for policymakers, and I think we see this more and more as we're having more extreme weather events, is that if they don't take action, they are they are indirectly and unaware that they are taking on more risk, because of course they are the insurers of last resort. They are the people that will end up with this on their own balance sheets.
And the report makes the wider point around communication, which you referred to earlier. The climate crisis, the communication about the climate crisis is generally done essentially by scientists, not risk experts, and that needs rethinking. It sounds like a big challenge, though. What do you think can be done to address that?
Yeah, so I think it's really important here that we're not sort of saying the scientists haven't done their job, because they really, really have. But it's about working together, and the key thing is really understanding the different ways in which science and risk operate, and then the consequences of those things. And throughout all of these reports, we have brought together risk professionals and climate experts. So the first one we worked with Sir David King. The later reports we've been working with Tim Lenton and his group at Exeter University. But actually, until we started having these conversations about this is how risk sees a problem and this is how the scientists approach a problem, you don't really understand that you can actually both be working in the same world, but in totally different paradigms. And I think the key thing we found here is that the risk idea of prudence is very different from the scientific idea of prudence. Science is all about factual documentation. Is there really a relationship? And until we're very, very sure there is a relationship, we're not going to say there is one. Risk, on the other hand, is saying, well, hang on, if you've got a really big downside, if there's a really big impact to society, whether you're certain or not that there is a link, if there could be a link, we should be looking at ways in which we can prevent it, taking management actions to avert that sort of crisis. So having those very different perspectives is important. And of course, the scientists are excellent in terms of the technical expertise they bring. But actually, this all came together because I think the scientists themselves, so Tim Lenton and Johan Rockstrom, they brought everybody together at a Tipping Points conference in 2022. And that was not just actuaries and scientists, that was activists, it was authors, it was experts in journalism, people that were from all different areas of life, because they recognized that everyone needs to be in this together, and there is a part for everybody to play, and you can't just get the messaging out through science alone.
Yeah, brilliant. And look, you're clearly very passionate about what you do and about this subject area. What first inspired you to work in the sustainability arena?
Yeah, so I actually started off doing a lot of D&I work, so diversity inclusion work, now DEI. And I think I gradually through that became aware that climate change is really unfair. It impacts the most vulnerable in our society the most, and those are also the people that have had the least to do with the situation we're in now. And so through that work, I started working with the IFOA on the Sustainable Development Goals, which of course encompass your of environmental risks, so like your climate and your biodiversity loss, but also some of the more social aspects, so your quality education, poverty, and some of the sort of economic impacts. So that's sort of what inspired me to get more into that area. And just the impact that we can have, particularly at the IFOA, from again quite a small institution, but with quite a lot of potential to do really good things.
I want to talk a little bit about your background while we have you here. For most people, studying for years to become an actuary would be tough enough, but incredibly, you before that, you qualified as a vet. So tell us a little bit about that and what made you switch.
Yeah, so I think I fundamentally like understanding how things work. And that doesn't matter whether it's natural systems and the sort of body systems or whether that's sort of finance and economics. And so finance to me sort of seemed like this big beast of a system that I wanted to get to understand because I could see how it impacts everyday life. I qualified as a vet in 2010. And it was just sort of 2 years after the financial crisis. There was a lot of economic turmoil. And actually, there was a lot of things I didn't quite understand about how the economy worked. And I think through sort of just researching the various roles that are out there, the actuarial work was really interesting in that respect, and eventually has again led to this much greater understanding, and again meeting groups of people that really understand how things are going on and how we can change things and sort of build a better sort of society for everyone, really.
Yeah, and you mentioned a parallel there between sort of understanding, a desire to understand how things work. You spend your Tuesdays working at as a vet in a small animal clinic in Swindon, which is near where you live. Are there other ways that the two contrasting roles complement one another?
Yeah, I mean it's difficult because I'd never say that they're sort of really similar. They're very, very different, but in both you need to think in systems. So whether you're looking at a human system, so bodies and respiratory, cardiovascular, etc., or an economic system, both are dynamic. You don't have an equilibrium. You have these constant feedback loops, and you have thresholds. You have these all or nothing events that can sort of trigger a totally different state. When we're looking on a more practical side, I think the sort of topics of antimicrobial resistance and One Health are really important. There's a direct link there. So, One Health is this sort of theory that human and animal health are inextricably linked and they're also interact with social factors. Um, but again, you've got links to things like pandemic emergence and zoonotic diseases. So as vets, you're on the front line and you can be diagnosing, zoonotic diseases, and sometimes it's stuff like ringworm, which is fairly self-limiting. Other times it can be stuff like, salmonella, campylobacter, leptospirosis, all things that animals can get and then can pass on to humans. And when we again look at the climate crisis and extreme weather events, again, you have outbreaks of diseases linked to these zoonoses. So I think, again, there's the two links there.
No, that sounds brilliant. Well, Lucy, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and views around the report, around the really vital and important topic of sustainability, and of course, a bit about your background as well. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again, Lucy. And the climate change reports have clearly been making a big impact among actuaries. Moving on to our third and final guest, it's Karabo Morule, who's dialing in from South Africa. She's an actuary who's turned a love of African art into an innovative business. Karabo, you're the guest for our Meet the Member slot in this episode, so I guess a good place to start is for you to tell us a bit about where you're based and maybe summarise your actuarial career for us.
Sure, thank you, John. So I'm based in Johannesburg, South Africa. I've actually lived here all my life, except for going to university at the University of Cape Town. And I guess that's where my actuarial journey started, maybe a little bit before that, because my father is a medical professional, and actually he told me about qualifying as an actuary because he was an expert witness in some cases, medical legal cases. And that's where he came upon actuaries. And I was very fortunate that in the high school that I attended, there were career days twice during my high school career. And there were actuaries who came and spoke about the profession. And I think that was a really good introduction to the profession. And actually kind of also had a bit of an unconventional start. So I've always worked in wider fields. My first job was actually in investment banking, working in equity derivatives at a global banking firm. I worked in Johannesburg for a year. And then I worked for 3.5 years in London. And the work I did there was certainly a bit closer to traditional actuarial work. I actually returned to South Africa and I started then working for an insurance company because I thought I hadn't worked in a traditional insurance environment before. And I thought I was going to feel a bit awkward calling myself an actuary if I never did. In a way, yes, I didn't necessarily do the traditional route of working in product development or pricing, but I certainly enjoyed my time in strategy and marketing as an executive there. And then I went on to work in customer solutions and thereafter then as managing director for one of the big business units selling individual life products, as well as savings and investment products as well. It's always kind of a very untraditional kind of, actuarial career in a way, but I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, lots of interesting and varied roles there, taking you into some exciting places at interesting times. You were, of course, also only the second black woman to qualify as an actuary in South Africa in the early 2000s. How did that make you feel? How much of an important landmark was that?
It's interesting, and I didn't necessarily think much of it at the time. Actually, at the time, I thought the race was on to become the youngest person to qualify as an actuary in South Africa. And actually, a good friend of mine put me to the post. I think it was maybe some 18 months before I qualified. So I didn't think much of it at the time. It was only really during my stint at this insurance company when it was now going to re-domicile back in South Africa, where as part of the listing statements and being a public officer, managing a very big business unit, they were like looking for information, and we were preparing for our investor roadshow day. And it was the CEO who said, "Karabo, you qualified so young, you must be somebody who is maybe the first or the second person who qualifies." So I went about and went and found the stat. And then I mentioned it in the investor day presentation. So I only really kind of cottoned onto it in 2018, much later after I qualified, about 12 years after I qualified. And I'm glad that I was not the second, and there's been many other people who have qualified after me.
Yeah.
And I was certainly inspired by many people in that road to qualification. Actually, the person who was my honours thesis lecturer was one of the first few women to qualify as an actuary in South Africa. So I think that inspiration has always been there.
And your venture capitalist business, Amara Strategic Investments, is specifically aimed at what you call disruptive ideas that have a positive impact on the African continent. Can you explain a bit more about that and how you do that?
Yeah. So I guess, like I mentioned, the one of the ideas that I was thinking about was actually getting into venture capital at that early stage, but this was around 2010. So it's something that I've always been kind of interested in conceptually, and maybe it's just because I've always loved finance, and that's kind of really an area that plays in. But not long after that, actually, a family friend who had also went to university with approached me because they were looking for seed investors in their business. And it was a payments platform. And I was really intrigued and really excited about this opportunity. And so I invested, and incidentally also my father was one of the seed investors. And they actually then approached me to be one of the first directors in the company as an investor representative. and I really relished in that opportunity. It was so exciting to work with people in the startup. They were based in Cape Town, and since then on, they've gone on into make such a significant impact in South Africa in the payment space. And I really relished in that opportunity. And so even in my work in a corporate career, I was fortunate to work with some early stage startups. And so that's been always an exciting area in terms of realizing the impact it can have in many ways. And so when I left my corporate job, that's really what I wanted to do, was to make angel investments and provide mentorship to early stage startups. But in fact, I wanted to be an investor operator, so to have the opportunity to operate in some of these startups as well.
Yeah, interesting. Your other new business is Capital Art, a software platform that helps people manage their collections of African art, but with a mission to get people to see African art as an asset class. How does that work? And do you own any African art yourself?
Yes, I do. But Capital Art, yes, it is about kind of enabling art collectors to maximize the value or manage their portfolios more efficiently, because I think that's, I'm trying to assist art collectors to maximize the value of their art collections by managing their portfolios more efficiently. The African art market is still quite small. And yes, even though I think initially I was really kind of very focused on trying to make sure that collectors of African art are very mindful about collection management, I think it's something that actually everybody should be mindful of. And so I actually often talk about the fact that what I'm doing is actually an act of financial inclusion, even though, yes, most of the time people think of art collectors as people who are very, very affluent, who don't need any financial inclusion. But certainly I think about it in the fact that many areas in the global majority are not aware of the rest of the art ecosystem. And certainly, yes, in art, there's specialist art insurance. So that's often the very big link between what I do or the actual profession more traditionally. But certainly art as an asset class is something to be mindful about.
And we thank you for sharing such an interesting and insightful story of your career to date. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you very much, Karabo, and thank you to all our guests this episode, and we hope you've enjoyed listening. Do join us again for our next podcast coming up after the March-April issue of the magazine, and we look forward to seeing you then.
This podcast is sponsored by Milliman. As one of the world's largest actuarial and consulting firms, Milliman's work is vital to solving the challenges faced by our clients, society, and the world. Through actuarial, risk management, and related technology and data solutions, we help companies navigate the complex health, finance, and insurance landscape. Because the future demands a different kind of thinking from a different kind of company. To learn more, visit milliman.com.